Hello, I'm Shannon, and today I'll be talking about bridging the gap between privacy incidents and PETs. And this is going to build really nicely on our previous discussion on threat modeling. So meet Bob. Bob is a PETs researcher, and he identifies a situation in which some system is revealing a user's data. So naturally, Bob wants to develop a solution which protects this user's privacy. And Bob realizes, you know what, all I need is a trusted third party, some Gaussian distributed noise, and a couple lattice-based assumptions, and we're good to go. Now we've got privacy, right? Problem solved. But the problem is Bob is a little bit, let's say, sheltered. And so his view of the problem space looks something like this, when in reality, the user lives in a world that's much more complex. So this is super related to what we've just discussed in terms of threat modeling, and we'll build upon this in more detail next. Before we get into the details, we want to narrow down the types of problems that Bob is concerned with. And we know that security and privacy threats often overlap. So here, by security threats, we mean things like data breaches and malware and attacks by hackers, but we're primarily concerned with privacy threats that do not require these kinds of breaches. So in particular, the systems that we're considering are those which are still working as they're intended to, but still result in a privacy violation. So that's the dark part of this diagram here. In order to develop our model, we also need a definition of privacy, and so we adopt Weston's definition of privacy, which states that it's an entity's ability to control how, when, and to what extent personal information about it is communicated to others. And finally, we're primarily interested in actual harms that are being caused to users by privacy violations. And this will motivate our focus on the kinds of problems that we might be trying to solve. So we've conveniently already discussed a couple examples of threat model mismatches, but I'll illustrate one more for you now. And this is a story of a priest who was involuntarily outed as gay to the public. So this priest was using the dating app Grindr to meet other individuals, and the app required location services in order to determine distances between users. What the users didn't know was that Grindr also collected their location paths and put them in an anonymized data set which was up for sale via some data vendor. And this attracted buyers which posed a threat to queer people, such as those working for a Catholic news publication on Substack. So this data was sold, and this news publication cross-referenced this anonymized location data with the places and times of religious conferences within their community. And this allowed them to identify different individuals within their community by comparing their Grindr location paths with the participant reports from these religious conferences. There was one identifier which showed up at multiple religious conferences and also at several gay bars. And so through their insider knowledge, this publication was able to identify this priest and out them as gay to the public. And they ended up resigning from their job. So we can see from this example that the flow of user data can be a lot more complex than we initially expect when we're using these kinds of services. And so what we've done is we've analyzed over 100 examples of this by looking at newspaper articles from the New York Times and Vice that contained privacy-related incidents. And then we used qualitative coding to understand how these attacks are actually unfolding. So we began with a simple three-party model, which might seem familiar to you if you know our friends Alice, Bob, and Eve. But if you try to map our priest story onto this, then it's easy to see that this is missing some context. First of all, it doesn't necessarily need to be the data subject that's sharing information about themselves. There can be an intermediate party. So for example, our priest may have consented to his location data being collected, but not necessarily to the date, time information being collected and that correlation with his location. Our devices often inherently hold additional information about ourselves that can be shared with external parties. Also, it wasn't the initial receiver of data, the Grindr app, who interacted with the attacker, which was the Catholic news publication. There was an intermediate party, the data vendor, which ended up selling the data. And so we landed on this five-party model, which we felt captured all the aspects of the real-world privacy violations that we analyzed. And this now allows us to do some more analysis to try to determine some patterns in how these attacks are actually occurring. So for each party and action in the model, we assigned a set of codes relating to the information gathered from the privacy-based attacks. And using this information, we can begin to do some analysis and observe some patterns. So going back to our priest example, the initial sharing of location data was actually necessary for usage in the app. And then the privacy violation here was disclosure of this information to the third-party data vendor. And this was accessed by financial means by the attacker. So we can repeat this process of drawing these connections for each privacy incident that we analyzed, and this allows us to visualize some patterns that are occurring. And then by observing these patterns, we can start to draw some conclusions about how privacy-based attacks seem to occur. So here in this visualization, the broader the edges are, the larger the proportion of our data set corresponded to these connections. If you look at how data is initially shared and the proportion of which that is actually necessary for the functioning of the service, you can kind of see how simple things like data minimization can go a long way. And you can also observe patterns in how data is being accessed by attackers. There's a significant portion of cases where attackers already have existing access to the data and then use it in unintended ways. We also grouped the types of harms, and we identified high-level categories, which gives us a starting point to understand what consequences users are actually facing as a result of privacy violations. But of course, news articles are only an approximation of reality, and so these harms are only a subset of those which are actually occurring in real life. And this method of analysis is particularly useful if we consider the different entities involved in these privacy-based attacks. So here we can visualize the data flow from the data subject on the left all the way to the attacker on the right. And you can see from this diagram that most users which suffer from an attack share their data with some company who shares it with another company who end up being the attacker. But it can also occur that companies give data to governments who then do harm, or that people are directly attacked by their governments. And so when designing technologies, we should be aware about which data is okay to share with companies and additional companies, and be aware of what could potentially end up being evidence in the hands of governments. So given these observations, as PETS researchers, it's natural to ask, at which point in the data flows do PETS make an impact, if any? Can the technologies that we're developing be used to impede these data flows and prevent these attacks in any way? To try to answer these questions, we conducted a parallel analysis of PETS in the literature. So we considered highly recognized papers which have won a Test of Time Award or the Casper-Bowden Award, and from those we looked at the papers which mention a real-world privacy scenario that they wanted to address. And if you won this award on Tuesday, don't worry, I haven't updated my slides since then. So we took these technical solutions and mapped them onto our same model of privacy-based attacks. And we found that the data flow is interrupted before the privacy violation occurs, which makes sense because PETS are aiming at preventing these kinds of violations. But what's interesting to look at is to whom these are really shifting control. So in the majority of cases, control shifts from one initial receiver to another initial receiver. And this could be something like a cryptographically constructed third party, which then becomes a new initial receiver. And in these cases, it's interesting to ask whether we're really solving the problem or if we're just redirecting trust. Other PETS shift control back to the data subject, which is nice because it aligns really nicely with Weston's definition of privacy. And finally, the control can also stay with the same party, but alterations to the data flow might occur that improve the situation. So we've also categorized the different ways in which these data flows are altered. In some cases, data flows are added. So for example, when data cannot initially be shared for legal purposes, but some distributed or joint computation then allows for that data to be shared. And it's interesting to ask in these cases whose interests are really being served. Most cases don't quite manage to fully intercept the data flow. Rather, we tend to achieve some form of narrowing of the data. So for example, maybe some data is encrypted, but metadata is still revealed. And in these cases, we might wonder if the data that is still revealed could allow for some privacy violations outside of the threat model considered in the PET. So we have a really good starting point. We've thought about threat modeling, and we've seen that simple models which allow for our technical analysis are often at odds with the complexities of real-life data flows. So we're curious how we can really capture the complexity of real-world systems in our PETS development. We focused on harms that are actually being caused to users, which provides new perspectives on trade-offs and trusts. And so we ask if PETS are more focused on protecting assets than they are at avoiding consequences. And finally, we've seen that existing PETS are sometimes adding data flows as opposed to intercepting them. And we wonder if this behavior is truly enhancing privacy. So I'll give you a few minutes to think about that among yourselves and discuss a little bit. I'll call up my colleagues to help lead the discussion, and we'll all discuss together in 5 minutes or so. So you can all convene in groups and discuss among yourselves for a few minutes.
You're live. If you don't want to be, push the button.
All right. Hello. Hopefully you've come up with some spicy takes about pets that you're going to share with us. And if you don't know what you want to say just yet, my first question to you would be, are we building pets wrong? Are we just transferring power to entities that the data isn't even about them, and we're just giving easier ways for companies in some cases to use data by adding some of these flows? Or is there a way we can encompass some of these scenarios into the threat models of our actual initial constructions of pets? Or literally anything.
More of a question. Are there a couple of examples you can point us to move away from the abstraction of adding data flows, but actual examples that will help us think through as well?
So if you want an example of something that is, let's borrow from the cryptography side of adding flows. If we think of something like a private set intersection, the idea is we're reducing the amount of information that needs to be shared between two organizations. Now let's say that it's two companies, a very commonly known tech company and perhaps a credit card company, that want to determine if ads that were shown online led to sales in physical stores. Well, they now think it's okay because we can determine whether that occurred by calculating this intersection between their two data sets. But now what we've actually done is introduced a way for this information to be revealed about those individuals who are using these services.
Okay, but are you then not just saying that pets are sometimes used as a justification to shitty things, and maybe people should not do shitty things, rather than the problem being with the pets per se?
Yeah, that's a good point. It could be, sometimes pets can be used for shitty things. But could it also be maybe we need to be designing something like private set intersection in a way that makes it easy for the individuals to know whether or not they want to have their information be put into these things? If we're just building these systems and only companies know about them, who's going to prevent them from being used in shitty ways or being designed in ways that could perhaps prevent your data from going into that system without your consent? You got it.
So, apropos to this point, you could be designing a shitty thing because you are not paying attention to the research. Vitaly and Arvind showed years ago that in the case of highly dimensional data, you know, it's very easy to do intersections, even though you think you have a high degree of anonymity. Once you take the dimensionality into account, you don't. And if you don't pay attention to that, well, big surprise, adding flows doesn't help you because you haven't taken that into account. So, yeah, do your research before you just start doing something.
Yeah, I think there are cases where two things that are undesirable are kind of at odds. So let me give you the example of psychology researcher who would like to learn more about sexual behavior of certain groups. For that, they need to collect very privacy-sensitive data. Probably this research will be beneficial to society to make policy decisions to protect vulnerable groups. And by designing PETs, in this case, for example, differentially private survey data collection methods, one might allow this researcher to collect the necessary data. But of course, a company could use the same techniques for collecting data about their users, and then not use this for the benefit of society, but for the benefit of their bottom line. And I think in these cases, it's very hard to prevent this misuse, and it's rather important to kind of be clear about that. Even though you use the PETs like differential privacy, there is still a certain harm to the privacy of individuals, and that companies cannot use this as an excuse to do something that just benefits them, but that this technique should only be used for things that benefit society.
All right, thanks. That was an interesting point in terms of knowing where things could be applied, and it's a complicated trade-off.
Let me maybe very clearly interject here, sorry, Bailey, which is that we've started discussing pets and privacy again in the context of data again, right? Even now in this short conversation, and I think one of the points we were trying to make is that, data does not care if its privacy is being violated. People do. And people are experiencing harms. And I think maybe one of the reasons why it is so easy to do this privacy pets washing of activities is that we frame these things as protecting data, when in reality maybe protecting people should be more of a focus.
I was saying that maybe like on pets, there might be a distinction between like pets where the company supposedly use some pets to anonymize the data or whatever, versus pets that the user uses to actually limit the amount of data that goes into the system. And I think that maybe reframing privacy protection's whole narrative more towards the latter can reduce a lot of these problematic data flows if like users actually just stop the data from getting into the system, or maybe even, I don't know, feed in fake data into the system or something like that. I think that might be just a very different approach to privacy protection that kind of like reduces the signal to noise ratio from the very beginning and protects people's privacy that way.
So to your point about perspectives on data, I think sometimes it's possible for pets to think about their goals as data has value and the problem of privacy is like stealing someone's valuable data against their will. And so the perspective becomes, how can we get as much value out of the population data set without stealing any one individual's owned data, when we should maybe be considering, if you're getting value out of the population level data, there are population level impacts, and that does have privacy implications as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thinking about these privacy harms and the fact that a lot of our definitions are very individual based, like when we think about differential privacy, for example, it's like, is this user identifiable? Is this, and I mean, I was aware of a case where there's a study done on a college campus where people asked very sensitive questions to the people with consent, et cetera. None of their data was leaked or linked to them, but the data was aggregated by living group, and the results of the study were then used by the administration to close a much beloved living group. And people who had consented to participate in the study felt extremely betrayed in this context because, and there was this idea, well, your privacy wasn't violated at all. No one knows exactly who you are, but still experienced a harm in aggregate. And I think thinking about privacy as not just like this individual atomic thing can sometimes be very helpful.
Yeah, I want to add something. Oh, sorry.
So actually linking back to what Rachel mentioned, I think one thing is about individual privacy aspects, and this also goes into regulations and laws, which a lot of them, especially including GDPR, are framed around individual data protection, which is not the same as privacy. And then the privacy harms being also like group privacy and of that. But there is, I think, an element of, from what I've heard many of people saying, is that there's perhaps the aspect of like purpose limitation, which should be built into the system, not as an afterthought, because now what we are saying is like, well, these are systems we've designed, we're not sure how it might be misused. So perhaps the misuse aspect is something we should think very hard about when we are designing some of these systems. Yeah.
Another part for me is like privacy has been more about being in control and having the choice rather than just the data. And for example, in privacy preserving ML, sometimes we say that if we can do it without learning the data, everything is okay. But the user needs to have the right to choose, should a model be built based on my information or not, before going through this. And the only thing that on the technology side we can do, we can give them people more choices to make that we can build this model without directly seeing your data or not. But still, we should not forget this fact of the user needs to have the choice. That's where privacy comes in.
Yes, actually, the thing I want to add to Rachel's comment is that about harm even after aggregation. For example, there are some countries where after voting, the government will punish whichever district where it have a lowest support level by cutting off their social support funding or something like that. So I think that is some example we can use when describing the thing, the situation where even after aggregation, the harm have already is also done in that situation. Over.
Right. Okay, thank you, everyone. So we're just going to wrap things up now. You all brought up really good points, and I think what it's kind of shown throughout the discussion is while in pets and throughout this whole week, we've seen a very wide range of pets that we are all building and working on. Each of them can be deployed in different contexts, and as soon as that is the case, we can have different types of information flows that is beneficial to be aware of from design point as we're considering what we're building, what its end goals are, and what we're actually trying to do as a final outcome for them. So really want to thank all of you for participating in the discussion.